Hi there, this is Political Dharma. I'm Alan Zundell, and as I record this, it is the morning of Saturday, May 24th, 2025. I did not run across many news stories this week that I was keen on commenting on. If you saw something that I missed, please let me know. Put it in the comments below. So instead of discussing the news this week, I decided I want to talk about a book I recently finished reading. This book is about past history in the United States, but it has some relevance to our situation these days. Let me bring it up for you. This book is entitled A Woman I Know, Female Spies, Double Identities, and a New Story of the Kennedy Assassination, written by Mary Haverstick. This presents the most convincing case that I've ever seen for who actually pulled the trigger and launched the bullet that killed President John F. Kennedy. Now, I just came across this book a few weeks ago. It had been published in November 2023, but I had not heard of it. I just accidentally found it in my local public library, brought it home and read it, and thought, wow, this is really something worth sharing. Now, let me give you a sense of where I was coming from in picking up this book in the first place. In other words, what were my views on the assassination of Kennedy way back in November 1963? I was alive when Kennedy was assassinated. I was 11 years old. I remember hearing the news in my afternoon at school and then being dismissed early to go home. I remember seeing the funeral procession on the TV. There was nothing else to watch at that time, and I think my parents were watching it, or maybe it was my grandmother. Maybe I was at my grandmother's house. In any event, I also remember the repeated playing of the video of the accused assassin Lee Harvey Oswald being shot point blank by Jack Ruby, who's usually described as a nightclub owner. I think he is actually a strip club owner, but I'm not sure about that. I'm not a Kennedy assassination buff, so I don't remember all the minutiae of this kind of thing. But I do remember the event, and I also remember the skepticism about it because I had an uncle, a bachelor uncle, who spent a lot of time reading about alternative viewpoints on reality like UFOs and paraphenomena. And he did, I'm pretty sure, have a copy of the Warren Commission report, which was the results of the government's official investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And he was aware of criticisms of the Warren report. So he did talk about that in my presence in my, early teens by that point, when I was around 12, 13, 14. So I was aware of the criticisms of it. So going forward in the decades from then, mostly my viewpoint was, okay, they gave their story of a lone gunman. It's probably not the whole truth, but we have no idea who else may have been involved. The mafia, Castro, maybe even some government intelligence or law enforcement agencies or agents or people associated with those agencies. Had no idea. We may never know. And was Oswald actually the assassin, or was he a patsy, as he said he was? Was there more than one gun person? Probably. That's kind of the mindset I had. Now, just about 5 years ago, during the pandemic, I spent a lot of time reading because I was at home back in Oregon and not a lot was going on. So I saw a Facebook post from a friend about a book having to do with the CIA and the Kennedy assassination. And that book kind of changed my view a little bit, in that I became convinced that probably CIA Director Allen Dulles was the principal architect of the Kennedy assassination. Now, this book was by David Talbot, and the title is The Devil's Chessboard, Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government. Allen Dulles was the first civilian director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and he held that position from 1953 until 1961, when then President John F. Kennedy fired him from that position. Dulles was very well connected to the wealthy business class, and he was also early in his tenure connected with Nazis from World War II. He was a vociferous anti-communist, like a lot of people in intelligence were at the time, and he saw Kennedy, as his presidency advanced, was becoming too soft on communism. That was his opinion anyway. Now, early on, when President Kennedy first took office, Dulles already had this operation in place to try to overthrow the Fidel Castro administration in Cuba. He put together, or the CIA under his direction, put together a kind of a invasion force, and they launched that on the shores of Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. And he told President Kennedy, that is, Dulles told Kennedy, that we would not need to send in any kind of American support, that these folks were able to actually overthrow Castro because they would have the public's support. That's what he told Kennedy. But secretly, his plan really was that once they got in there and the invasion force started to falter, Kennedy would be pressured to send in air cover and maybe military backup, like ships in the port and those kind of threats, to help the revolution succeed. But Kennedy did not want to get into a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union over Cuba because of nuclear weapons on both sides. So he felt betrayed by Dulles, and he also did not trust the CIA any longer. So he fired Dulles and one of his top lieutenants, and he vowed privately that he was going to break the CIA into a million pieces, I think. I'm paraphrasing, but the idea was he wanted to get rid of the CIA. So, having read that book, I thought he made a very convincing case for how Kennedy's viewpoints on communism were shifting, especially his, like in his campaign of 1960 when he was running for the presidency. He was talking about, beefing up our military forces and being more of a hardline anti-communist. But once he got into office, he started to realize that he needed to have a different policy, and especially when he felt lied to and betrayed by his own intelligence agencies and military, he thought, well, we need to go in a different direction here. So he signed, not only did he refuse to support the Cuban invasion at the Bay of Pigs, he, in the eyes of people further right, backed down during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet Union had placed missiles in Cuba, which is not that far off the shores of Florida. And Kennedy, rather than doing what a lot of military folks wanted to do, which was aggressively confront the Soviet Union and demand the removal of these missiles, he used more quiet diplomacy to try to de-escalate and get this thing resolved, get the missiles out of there without that kind of necessary escalation in tensions during the Cold War. And finally, he started talking about a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. So warming up relations, diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in order to deal with the mutual threat of nuclear annihilation. This made a lot of these hardcore anti-communists very angry. So they had motive. They thought Kennedy was betraying the country to the communists. They had the means. They knew a network of, sleazy people as well as spies and people who could undertake some kind of assassination plot. Motive, means, and perhaps they had a hand in it. So it convinced me that probably there was a role for Allen Dulles in here in setting this up somehow, but it wasn't clear exactly what was going on with Oswald and the details of the plot. Other than that, maybe he had more to say that I'm forgetting, but that's what I was left with. So I was more open to the idea that this is what was behind it. I should add that when the government, when Lyndon Johnson, the new president, decided to have an investigative committee look into the Kennedy assassination, this is called the Warren Commission because title of the chair of the committee went to Earl Warren. I think he was Supreme Court judge I think he was already Supreme Court judge. But he also appointed Allen Dulles, the former director of the CIA, to that committee, and Dulles really took charge of it on a day-to-day basis, and Warren was left more or less as a titular figure. They trusted Dulles because he was formerly in the business of intelligence, so presumably he would have some ability to assess the reports from the FBI and the CIA and the rest, and have the best interests in the country at heart or whatever. So that was another piece of information that, okay, not only did he have the motive and the means to carry out this assassination, he also had the ability to cover it up. So what is this new book about? How does this play into the Kennedy assassination? And I will be discussing why I think this is still something of relevance. The book was about a woman who named Jerry Cobb. She was a pilot, and she was the first woman to pass all 3 phases of the testing to become a Mercury astronaut for the National Aeronautic and Space Agency. Here she is pictured in 1960. She's on a apparatus called the gimbal rig that's in an altitude wind tunnel. So she's undergoing a test, or at least she's posing as though she's undergoing a test for NASA. And she was also instrumental, after she passed those tests, in getting 12 other women to pass the test as well. They were called the Mercury 13 because to some extent they were qualified to be astronauts. Now, they never became astronauts because it was also a requirement that to become an astronaut, you had to have experience flying military jets, and the military did not allow women to fly jets. They did not have any women jet pilots in any branch of the military, so they were not able to overcome that hurdle, and it left Jerry Cobb a little bit bitter. And she went on to become well known for other things. Supposedly, she went way down to, now the reason I say supposedly will become evident, she went down to South America and spent a lot of time helping the indigenous tribes down there. Why is she important? Now, there's a little story involved in how the author of the book I just finished, Mary Haverstick, became involved in telling the story of Jerry Cobb. She came across the story about her role in the NASA space program, passing the test and getting other women to pass the test, and she was intrigued by that. Now, Haverstick is a filmmaker, and she thought this would make a good movie. It had a heroic figure and some suspense and drama involved in it, and like a underdog against the odds, proving herself and proving, her whole gender was capable of more than they were thought to be capable of at that time. So she saw the potential for a good movie in this, and she looked into it, read a book about it, and found out a little more about it, and decided to reach out to Jerry Cobb, who was then in her 70s. She found it wasn't easy to reach her, got rebuffed a number of times in sending emails, but after years trying, she did reach Cobb and set up a meeting, and in the course of that meeting, Cobb agreed, even though she was kind of a strange figure, that is, she wouldn't eat anything in their presence, and she had kind of a, reserved aspect to her. I mean, overtly friendly, but you knew she was not being completely relaxed and forthcoming. Anyway, she agreed to be continually interviewed by Haverstick and to have her story told by her. So Haverstick started looking into it further and doing more research. And in the meantime, she met a woman who she later found to be have a job in military intelligence, I think it was. It was one of the intelligence agencies. I forget if she specified which one. So Haverstick was on a camping excursion, and this woman set up camp right next to her, befriended her, and they remained friends afterwards. So they spent time together, and the woman started asking her, what do you do? And found out about the film project and started warning her, saying, I don't think you should make that film, in very subtle and not so subtle ways. Eventually, the woman was in Haverstick's studio and saw some of the research documents lying about, one of them in a big binder, and she said, that's classified material, that should be under lock and key, you should not have that. Even though, now Haverstick knew she had it from Jerry Cobb and had permission to do it, and it wasn't that highly classified that it couldn't be in public hands. And she kind of found it strange that this woman was taking such an interest in this project and trying to dissuade her from undertaking it. So at some point, she learned that the woman was intelligent, in intelligence, and she did a search online for Jerry Cobb plus CIA to see if anything would come up. And it did. Thousands of documents came up, but the name that was attached to them was not Jerry Cobb, it was June Cobb. Very similar name. And as she learned more about June Cobb, she found out that their backgrounds, their biographies, were similar in a lot of ways. Where they grew up and, details like that, little details, where they lived, where they moved, where they traveled, when they were traveling. They're both pilots. A lot of synchronicities that seemed kind of strange. And she found that a lot of those documents referenced June Cobb spying in Cuba and June Cobb name coming up very frequently in the files on the JFK assassination. In 1975, there was a House Select Committee on Assassinations that investigated those of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and I think Martin Luther King Jr. And they're, voluminous documents from there. And she found that this name was coming up in a lot of those documents as well as many others. So she was looking into this and reading all these documents and slowly learning how to interpret them and talking to people who had better understanding of that so she could better understand them, because a lot of them have various codes and ways of designating documents that she didn't quite understand. So she was learning more, and she learned that this June Cobb, I think, somehow she connected an airplane at an airport, Redfin Airport, just outside of Dallas, Texas, where Kennedy was assassinated. A plane flew in and was on the runway revving its engines. Now, this is the same day that Kennedy was assassinated. And she thought, now that sounds like it could be the type of plane that Jerry Cobb used to fly a lot. So she thought, this is strange. June Cobb's name coming up in the Kennedy assassinations files, a report of an aircraft like the one Jerry Cobb used to fly, landing at an airport just outside of Dallas, and then taking off the same day. Landed before the assassination, took off after the assassination. She thought this was all very strange, so she brought it up in her next interview with Jerry Cobb. And as she told her about this friend that kind of out of the blue befriended her and ended up being an intelligence in what she was saying about the project, none of this seemed to faze Cobb. She just took it kind of blasé attitude, even when Haverstick said that she thinks June Cobb knows who killed Kennedy. That didn't faze Cobb either. All she had to say is, yeah, she's aware of this woman, June Cobb, and that sometimes that Cobb impersonated her, Jerry Cobb. Didn't have a lot to say about it, didn't seem surprised by it or shocked by it or curious about it, anything like that, which Haverstick, of course, found to be very strange as well. But when she mentioned the Redfin Airport outside of Dallas, that seemed to land a blow on Jerry Cobb. She sat back like she was shocked. She looked up, she was teary, she gained composure, and she said, I was there, meaning she was the pilot of that aircraft on that day. And she went on to say something about how she had flown in some photographers from Life magazine for the Dallas. Kennedy was going in a what am I trying to say? A parade or there's a word for it, but you know what I mean. They're in a bunch of cars going down the road. He was waving to the crowds and all that. So she said she was there. She flew in with his car. They never got off the plane, according to her story. And then they heard about the president's assassination over the radio, and she was afraid that they would close down the airspace over the airport and they wouldn't be able to leave. Now, she didn't explain why these photographers and reporters did not get off the plane as soon as they got there, or why they didn't get off the plane when they heard the president was assassinated. You'd think they want to go and get the news story. So that was all very strange as well. Her reaction to the Redfin Airport, her revelation that that was her piloting the plane, and then her kind of cover story about what she was doing there. None of that made sense. All right, so Haverstick did a little more research on the June Cobb, Jerry Cobb connection. And I'm going to show you an example of what she discovered when she tried to put their chronologies of their life side by side. And what you are seeing is a page that has kind of a chronology going down, and June Cobb on the left column, Jerry Cobb on the right column. And what Haverstick was doing here is listing the dates and the occasion on which one of those two could be documented, not just that they said they were at that place at that date, but actually there is corroborating evidence from some other source about where they were at the time. And what you see is she finds what she calls a checkerboard pattern. In this case, all these documented locations for Jerry Cobb that suddenly end at a certain point, and then June Cobb picks up, and Jerry Cobb's documented sightings or knowledge of where she actually was disappear. So whenever June Cobb seems to be active in a way that can be documented, Jerry Cobb is not, and vice versa. And this, of course, tipped her off that probably June Cobb and Jerry Cobb are the same person. And Jerry Cobb is, because she was a agent of the CIA using the pseudonym June Cobb, she couldn't talk about that, but she was willing to let Haverstick kind of probe into this stuff, even though she didn't want to tell her outright what was going on. She didn't seem fazed that Haverstick was learning this stuff and bringing it up to her, but she had excuses for why it wasn't something that could be trusted, but never shocked, never upset, except that one moment when she revealed that she had been at the airport. All right. So she did more investigation. She actually found there were other identities that Jerry Cobb took as well. Or at least there was some evidence she provided that these agents with other names could have been Jerry Cobb as well. Some of them quite shocking, actually, and surprising. If you don't know a lot about the Kennedy history, then you might know one part. Anyway, I won't get into that. This could be a very long video. That if I will go into all of it, it's a lot of intriguing stuff. And she does a very good job of documenting this stuff to the point where you have to read slowly and carefully to try to follow it. All right, so she finds that June Cobb was involved in CIA assassination department. There was a separate unit they set up that was under very high coded language for assassinations. And Jerry Cobb's name, no, not Jerry Cobb. Let me jump to that first. There was an agent called JQ Wynn. JQWI Wynn, that's the code name or like a abbreviated acronym that they use for this agent, who was involved in some of the early assassinations in the special unit the CIA set up. Some of those involved, on the one hand, you see Fidel Castro on the right there. He's the one with the beard and the lighter colored uniform. Castro, as we mentioned before, they tried to overthrow him, but there were also assassination plots. The earliest around 1960, before Kennedy took office, they tried to poison him, and this agent, J.Q. Wynn, was involved in delivering the poison to the person who was going to then get it into the system of Fidel Castro somehow. And on the left there, the man in the center is Patrice Lumumba. He was the first prime minister of the newly independent Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the CIA was concerned that he was going to lean towards the Soviet Union instead of the West, and they set in motion assassination plot. It ended up that there was a military coup, and that the leader of the coup, who had CIA connections, had Lumumba killed. So that was an assassination that the CIA had set up in a way. It didn't go exactly as they planned, but certainly they were involved in it. So there were these assassination plans. Now, beyond these two, there was a operation with the code name ZR Rifle, that is ZRRIFLE, and they were setting up an assassination of some figure in some other country. A lot of coded language about which country and where they were and all that. But As Haverstick looked into this, she did a similar type of comparison in the chronology of June Cobb, Jerry Cobb, and J.Q. Wynn, the agent who was involved in assassinations. And what she found was very similar. You know, there's a period where June Cobb is active and Jerry Cobb is not. And then the shaded area at the bottom is where J.Q. Wynn was active. And neither of the other two, neither of the Cobbs, were documented as being in certain locations at certain times. So here she's making the case that Jerry Cobb not only was June Cobb, but she was J.Q. Wynn, the agent involved in coordinating and setting up assassinations. All right, so now we have the plot here thickening with the CIA director, who is not, who according to the records, was not, quote, officially, end quote, informed of this assassination of this this later one after Lumumba and Castro, but you can suspect that he probably was, and they just didn't want to document that he knew what was going on in order to insulate the CIA to the extent possible. So he had the motive, the means to assassinate Kennedy, and now the JQ Wynn involvement in the Operation ZR Rifle looked like it was probably the plot to kill John F. Kennedy. All right, so let's cut to the chase here, the denouement of all of this. There is a mysterious woman who was filmed at the time of the Kennedy assassination on the parade route. She's called the babushka lady. A babushka is a kind of a scarf head covering that women from Europe wear. And this woman at the on the parade route was there with a bulky camera, and there are photos of her taken. And you know where this is going, I suspect. And I will tie it together for you if it's not quite clear. All right, this is one of the photos from a film taken by a woman called Maria Muchmore. And the arrow on the right is pointed towards the babushka lady. It's a little unclear of a photo because it's from an amateur film that this woman was taking from further back. You see there the Kennedy limousine moving forward. And this is just at the moment that Kennedy was shot, like maybe a split second afterwards. So you see the babushka lady sitting there. And if you back up the car just a little, you would have a clear view directly towards that car. Now, nobody's ever identified her before now, and nobody ever saw any of the footage from the big camera she had in her hands. So she was standing there with her legs apart with a camera in her hand, and as the Kennedy motorcade passed at the time when he was shot multiple times. Further on in this film, after the car had sped away to get Kennedy to a hospital, you see people on the ground because there were shots that had rung out and everybody dropped, except the babushka lady. She's still standing there calmly looking around. You see the police running back and forth and trying to figure out, anything suspicious going on, looking for suspects. But she's just standing there. And moments later, this is a photo from somebody else. Not sure the provenance of this photo, but there she is, calmly walking away. She's been colorized to make her stand out. She has her babushka is a little loose. She has hair, dark curly hair, glasses, bulky coat on. It looks like it could be a disguise, right? Hair that could be a wig, glasses, that babushka on her head, that bulky overcoat, all those things. If you wanted to disguise yourself as a woman, that would be a good idea. Now, there is another photo that's alleged to show the babushka lady right there as the Kennedy motorcade is passing. There's a circle around her. Yeah, I'm not sure where this photo came from, either who took it, but it apparently is right around the time Kennedy was passing somebody with a babushka. And you look at her face, and that's supposed to be her as well. Okay, so where is this all going? You guessed it. The theory of Haverstick is that babushka lady was actually Jerry Cobb. As June Cobb, she had experience in the spy field and in assassinations in particular. She was an expert marksman, or marksperson, I should say. She had a bulky camera that could be a hidden gun that the CIA developed, and she was in a position where she could easily shoot at Kennedy if that camera was actually a gun. There's little gaps. She actually moved in a way as though she was following the motorcade until it got to that little gap and then shooting her pictures. Just at the same time the shots rang out. Now, that was also the time the shots came from the book depository where Oswald was working. And Haverstick suggests that the Oswald shots were a cover for the Babushka Lady shots. Babushka Lady had been the only one making bang, bang noises. It would have been obvious. Everybody would have turned and saw her standing right there, not far from the curb where Kennedy's limousine was passing. It would have been obvious that was her. But because they first rang out from the book depository, people looked up in that direction, started to drop, panic, confusion. She's standing there still and snaps her camera and looks at the aftermath. So it really looks like she was involved, and you go further on, it's like Oswald, yes, was involved in this. He was knowingly involved, and Haverstick's conclusion is that that was Jerry Cobb there. She was more of a principal in setting this up. She was the one who was actually going to do the assassination, and they found ways to cover their tracks. That she had flown into the Redfin airport, and that she was waiting for Oswald in order to fly out. That's the reason she was left on the airport tarmac with the engines revving, because Oswald was spotted in the book depository, and then he got away because the manager of the book depository vouched that he was an employee there. And then when he disappeared, they sent out a police bulletin giving his description. He was spotted, shot a policeman who tried to stop him, killed that policeman, and then was hiding in a movie theater when they caught him. So his escape was foiled, and he was the only one that was caught. They had a whole cover story trying to show that this airplane was going to Cuba, which it did when it finally took off. And it took off. It was there on the tarmac for a long time until the news of Oswald's capture came over the radio. That's the point at which the plane finally took off. Haverstick shows that it was probably a plane that landed in Cuba shortly after that, within the time frame for leaving the Dallas airport. And somebody left that plane, didn't go through customs, and got on a plane to Cuba. So the idea was that there was a cover story is that whoever these assassins were, they escaped to that airport and they flew to Cuba, and that's how they got away. Now, I think it went to Mexico City first. Went to Mexico City, did not go through customs, and then got caught a plane to Cuba. So that would, the Mexico City record would show that a plane had been there, which Haverstick found out was the case. And somebody mysteriously got off one plane onto another plane, took off. They held the second plane for several hours, waiting for this mysterious passenger to show up from the other plane. So circumstantial evidence, but it piles up to the point where I was very convinced that this is what actually happened. All right, let me give you one closing piece of information that might help you make up your own mind. I did a comparison between a photo of the Babushka Lady and a photo of Jerry Cobb back in 1960. So this would be only a few years apart. You look at them, maybe overtly they don't look exactly alike, but if you examine it, look at the cheeks as she smiles. Her smile seems to be about the same width, and she has the same kind of cheek configuration. The chin looks very similar. The nose is a little hard to tell, but it could be similar. She's got sunglasses on and either dyed her hair or had a wig on. So that could, in my eyes, it looks very similar to Jerry Cobb, giving you another nail in the coffin on this theory of who actually assassinated John F. Kennedy. Now, why is this important? I would say a couple of reasons. Number one, for me and everybody else that's curious about the Kennedy assassination, it was a big event in our history and it was never solved. So this is kind of a way to, settle your mind, that there is a resolution to this puzzle. It feels satisfying to know this. Now I realize that this kind of evidence would not necessarily hold up in a court of law and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that was Jerry Cobb who shot Kennedy under those strange circumstances, especially since the intelligence agencies, CIA in particular, and probably the FBI, would be motivated to throw out a lot of disinformation, as we call it now, and look to those cover stories about where, who was, when, and who did what. So there, it'd be more confusing for a jury to try to sort this out. And it could be information that yet comes to light that show that this is not quite the correct story, but it seems awfully convincing and satisfying to me to have some sense of, okay, now we have an idea of what very likely happened on that day. Going back to my childhood, thinking, okay, that was past history. Let's deal with my life in the present. What's this got to do with right now? I think, yeah, if this came out, it would further erode trust in the government, which is eroded pretty far. But I think that's going to be a necessary thing. I don't think we should put that much trust in our government. I think there are still secrets there. And until we face the secrets of our past, I don't think we're ever going to come to terms with the reality of our present. And this would be a pretty big secret if the CIA orchestrated the assassination of Kennedy, which really changed histories in a lot of ways. I didn't mention that Kennedy was considering and likely going to pull whatever initial, we didn't really have troops in Vietnam. We had like so-called military advisors. I think they were CIA trainers and folks like that. Anyway, instead of escalating, he wanted to pull out. And that would have changed my life as well as the lives of a lot of other people if that had happened. So changing the course of history. And it shows us that we need to be honest about what this country has been, what our government has been, how we got to the point we did, and how these kind of hidden secrets and operations and giving some government agency the authority to do things like assassinations and cover it up and then allow someone who was the head of that agency to be part of the investigation. We shouldn't let something like that ever happen again. This should be investigated even further to put it to rest once and for all. There should be some accountability where the CIA takes responsibility and reforms for that. Actually, I wouldn't mind if they were all operational capacity was taken away and they were just limited to do intelligence gathering, not they're doing all kind of things now. They're around the world, using drones to bomb people in various places. So I think we need to confront our past, own up to the sins of the past, recognize the potential for these kind of things to be repeated if we don't accept the reality of that horrible period in this country's history. All right, that's it for this week. Thanks for watching. I hope it was of some interest to you. If you like this channel, you can come back and watch me talk about news or my own agenda for our political times. I also have a channel called Buddha Meets Jesus, which is more about spirituality and somewhat about its impact on politics of today. So if you like this, like, subscribe, check out my other channel, leave comments. Love to hear from you. And I will be back with other stuff at some point in the future. Thanks. Bye.